Thank you very much, Kieran. I'm almost embarrassed to start speaking after that. I've got a lot to live up to. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, hopefully the technology will all work, and I'm going to try not to touch anything for fear I might cause some disaster. After the Tenements, two contrasting images here at the top, just to start thinking about how far Dublin has come. And just to get something out of the way very quickly, I'm sure you're all well aware, but what is a tenement? It's generally, apart from in Scotland, but generally taken to refer to a large dwelling house which has been subdivided to provide for many different families, so for multiple family occupancy. And in Dublin, many of these homes began as high-class homes for the wealthy, rather like the one in which we are now privileged to sit. And that is what led to Abercrombie's wry observation that we had the most architectural slums in Europe. Architectural or not, of course, houses intended for a single family and its servants were woefully inadequate for the needs of multiple families, and over time lack of maintenance led to increasing dilapidation and so on, as we shall see. Now, I was presented with the title after the Tenements. It wasn't one that I dreamt up, but I actually thought it was quite intriguing because it's where do you begin? Where is after the Tenements? It's quite provocative. So perhaps we need to think of Dublin in the late 70s and into the 80s. This is Dublin as I remember it as a child, when the last of the tenements were still here on Summerhill and in Sean McDermott Street, finally being taken down by the corporation. So that's really the tail end of the tenements. Or should we go back to the 1960s? When the tenement collapses of 1963 led to a degree of panic. A tragic story of these two little girls from Holles Street who were going to the sweet shop and were buried by a tenement collapse. There were two collapses very close in time, one here on Fenian Street, a second on Bolton Street, which led to a degree of panic and really acted as a catalyst for the development of the shining city on the hill, which was Ballymun, and I saw the picture upstairs in the museum. Or perhaps we go back a bit further in time, 50 years back, which Kieran just referred to there, when Dublin received international coverage in 1913 following another tenement collapse. This time 7 people were killed on Church Street. The Dublin, a city of homeless people and grief-stricken parents, is the heading in the Daily Sketch. This image was from Le Miroir in Paris, slightly later. It wasn't immediately at the same time, but depicting the poor, impoverished children of Dublin taking shelter in a doorway. Or perhaps I should be extremely provocative and suggest that in light of a recent RTE report showing cases in Dublin where we had 12 and 15 people living in single rooms, that we're still not living in a post-tenement era. So all of these different beginnings would have a certain logic to them, but I'm going to take a rather longer term approach. It would be a very short talk if I started with this slide. And I'm going to start about a century ago when the problem of Dublin's slums was beginning to be tackled in a meaningful way. And I'll discuss some of the issues that arose along the way and the approaches taken which ultimately shaped the city as we know it today. But the alternative beginnings, I think, is important for us to think about because they highlight a point that's worth bearing in mind. And that's that we don't have a story of Dublin's housing problems as a tale of a straightforward progression from worse to better or constant improvement, but one with lots of twists and turns. And these are just some of the points of inflection on an ongoing journey. So to start to understand that journey, we need to get a little bit of context. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the background to the tenements, but I do need to give you a little bit. And then we'll talk about the attempts made to address the issues from the time of that 1913 inquiry up until around about the mid-1960s or thereabouts, ending with something on evaluating the successes and failures of what was done. So we can actually start in 1798 with James Whitelaw's essay on the population of Dublin, which showed that tenements were already very much a feature of the capital. But I suppose the circumstances of the 19th century really led to an increase in their prevalence. And there are a lot of parts to this story. One, of course, is the 1801 Act of Union. Don't worry too much at the back. You're not missing a lot. This is just really almost a reminder for myself of some things I need to say. With the Act of Union, the exodus of some of Dublin's more prominent citizens, the people who were residing in these kinds of houses, the property market basically crashed. And over time, these houses, which would have been very expensive in the late 18th century, really lost their value. And that made it possible for slum landlords to acquire them and to convert them for multiple occupancy. But there were still shared closets, sometimes water closets, sometimes something more basic, in a backyard, and perhaps a water pump there or maybe in the street, being shared by many different families. And usually a family would have one or two rooms. You might have the front parlour, you might have an upstairs room. Sometimes, in the worst and most extreme cases, you had more than one family in the same room, you know, a family in each corner. So you can imagine the degree of overcrowding. Something that my students find very hard to get a handle on is the fact that the owners of these slum tenements were from every strata of Irish society. And they were Irish people. This isn't a case of all these bad absentee landlords over there somewhere else. These were Irish people. There was a very complex ownership structure in the tenements, which made it very difficult to tackle. With head landlords, and then they would have a long lease, and then it was a very complicated system indeed, which I can't go into now, but Mary Daly has written extensively about this. By the second half of the 19th century then, we see people describing the situation in the tenements, and basically the fact that these were the main cause of the excessively high death rate in Dublin. Dublin's death rates were much, much higher than equivalent cities in Britain. And the 1879 data tells us that there were almost 10,000 of these tenement houses. 47%, almost half of all the people in Dublin were living in tenements. The average persons per house, 12. Of course, there were cases of 40, 50, 60, 70 people in a house, all sharing that one closet out in the backyard. Although apparently the ladies tended not to go out, they had a little pot under the bed. And of course, I suppose I should say too that not all of the slums were tenements, and perhaps not all of the tenements were slums. We're not just talking in Dublin about subdivided houses, but there were slums in every nook and cranny of the city, the back lanes, the courts, the alleyways. These are the cellars, the worst of all. These are remarkable images taken in 1913. They're the darkest Dublin collection, very aptly named, and they show just how awful conditions were across the city. It was a widespread problem. And it wasn't one that was going to be easy to resolve. As Tom Kelly, the famous alderman and leader of the Housing Committee of Dublin Corporation for many years, he argued that the solution of the housing problem would be simple if work and wages were plentiful. The main cause of the social evils of Dublin, he said, is the dire poverty of the major proportion of the working classes. So the problem wasn't just that there was a poor housing stock. The problem was that we had an impoverished workforce, about a third of the population classified as being unskilled labourers. They were depending on casual labour. And that meant that they had a very low rent paying capacity. If there was better housing available to them, they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford to pay for it. And that was a problem that the corporation came up against that time and time again in attempting to solve the problem. I can't neglect the suburbs, however. The city at the time was very tightly defined within the canals and the circular roads, and that was the area that was governed by Dublin Corporation. And in Dublin, as in just about everywhere in the 19th century, we have this start of an exodus, a movement of middle-class populations out into suburban areas. The problem was that in Dublin, those suburban areas were outside of the control of the corporation, which meant that these people were living in independently governed areas known as townships, and they were paying their rates, their local taxes, to the township commissioners, not to the corporation. They were still availing of all of the facilities of the city, of course, because they were literally just a hop and a skip away. But from a taxation point of view, it left the city fathers in a very difficult position because they weren't getting the income that they needed to tackle these problems. This map, the blue lines are just showing the various different townships. We had Pembroke, Rathmines, Blackrock, Kingstown, Dalkey down to the south. And we had Drumcondra and Clontarf to the north. We also had New Kilmainham out to the west, but that was the only one which was largely working class. The townships and this very fragmented governance structure, of course, caused all sorts of complications. They had their own services. On the left here of this slide, we see the Pembroke Township Fire Brigade. And that lovely building is the fire station. It's still there. If you go to the main hall of the RDS, just look to your right slightly and you'll see that beautiful building. I could talk about that more, but I can't. They all had their own different characters as well, these different townships. Drumcondra here, this is a postcard saying everything first class at Drumcondra. But of course, we I suppose must concede that it was a lower middle class area which developed somewhat later. So this is what's going on around the city at this time. And back in the tenements then we have extreme, severe overcrowding. It's shown here in the census returns. This is just an excerpt. I could have picked hundreds of these, thousands of these. This one is a man called James McDowell, a 55-year-old general labourer living in a tenement, a two-room tenement at Mabbott Street, with his wife, his daughter-in-law, grandson, three of his other children, the youngest of whom I think is 14, so they're pretty much grown, and two boarders who are also general labourers. So this was a way of supplementing your income, taking in boarders or lodgers. And when you think that all of these people, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people living in these two rooms, you can get a sense of what it must have been like. And of course, the biggest issue for Dublin was the fact that these were one-room tenements to a very large degree. And the nature of these one-room tenements was particularly problematic in terms of the high death rates and the spread of disease, particularly, of course, TB, tuberculosis. In fact, I just was reading today, I was looking back on some notes, Belfast had more tenements than Dublin did in 1901. The difference was that in Belfast, there were only 1% of the tenements had just one room. In Dublin, about 37% of the tenements had just one room, and that made a huge difference. Slums, and particularly the tenements, the black are tenement houses on the map, and all of the kind of the fawn or beige areas, these are all slum areas. So basically, the whole map, the whole of Dublin is pretty much full of slums at this time. The third-class tenements, the worst, the ones that are unfit for human habitation, are mentioned. This is actually from 1925 in the Civic Survey. So that was another thing about Dublin that was different. The slums were everywhere. The tenement houses were very widespread. It wasn't just one particular area that you could zone in on and fix. So that brings us back to the inquiry that was held in 1913, this very significant year, the collapse and the deaths of 7 people, two tenement houses on Church Street. What really heightened the reaction, because this wasn't the first collapse, and as we've seen, it wasn't the last. Houses were still collapsing 50 years on. But this coincided with the lockout. This was at the early stages of this Dublin labour crisis, and of course was this recognition that perhaps people wouldn't be up in arms about their labour rights if they had been adequately housed. Even the Irish Times, which was notoriously conservative, conceded this point. So this heightened and highlighted the issue. The public inquiry, its findings were so shocking that even the Chief Secretary for Ireland described the state of things as being horrible and intolerable, and said that this report should not be left, as other reports had been, in pigeonholes, but should be acted upon immediately. We'll see how that turned out in a moment. So what did the inquiry say? Well, evidence was heard from 76 witnesses over 17 days in November 1913. The collapse happens at the start of September. So November we have 76 witnesses in 17 days, and they also conduct visits to tenements. And the report is published in the following February. So they're pretty, impressive in the speed of that turnaround. I think we could learn something from that too. But the findings were stark. So of all of the tenements in the city, the first class, those that were structurally sound, it doesn't mean that they were palatial or luxurious, but that were simply structurally sound. That's all you had to be to qualify as being first class. 27,000 people lived in those. We had 37,500 people in houses that were decayed or so badly constructed that they were on the borderline of being unfit for habitation. And we had a further 22,701 people living in third-class houses. These are the houses that are unfit for habitation and incapable of being rendered fit. They are so bad that you cannot rehabilitate these dwellings. So this was incredibly shocking. And condemning the houses and closing them down would have made the problem worse, because it would have led to further overcrowding somewhere else. There was nowhere else for the people to go. The scale of the problem was such that there were 14,000 houses urgently required. They would have to be in suburban locations because there wasn't enough space within the city to rehouse everybody at appropriate standards. And the cost was such that it would require government action, unfortunately, as it turns out. Now, what had the corporation been doing? Because as we have seen, the tenements have been around for a long time. The first efforts of the corporation go back to 1883. And in the 30 years between the first corporation housing and the inquiry, they had managed to build 5,271 dwellings. Now we're at a situation in 1913 where we need 14,000 houses now. So you can see, and that's for 60,000 people. So it's going to be a very, very major task. And this suburban idea is coming to the fore as a solution, but we'll see how that works out. Now, unfortunately, the best laid plans and the hopes of something happening as a result of this inquiry, published, remember, February 1914, war intervenes. And apart from the most urgent of plans, things are put on hold. And ironically, again, for those of you at the back, this is a recruitment poster from 1915. Is your home worth fighting for? This is issued in Dublin. I don't know what they were thinking of, because there's a very obvious answer to that question. However, Alderman Kelly, who I've already mentioned, of the Housing Committee, when they were pleading with London to give them funds, to actually enable them to borrow money, not to give them the money, but to borrow money to do something, said Dublin alone has sent 14,000 men to fight the Empire's battle. are they to find the Empire's gratitude on their return represented in the refusal of the government to allow the corporation to lift their wives and children from the horrors of life in dilapidated tenement houses or cellar dwellings into the atmosphere of light and life in a sanitary, self-contained, comfortable home? Government, sadly, did not step up. Government was probably regretting this in the following year, in 1916, when things took a turn for the worse in Dublin. And the quote, which you cannot see on that slide, is from George Bernard Shaw, who said, oh why didn't the artillery knock down half Dublin when it had the chance? And the slums could have been swept away, and wouldn't it have been great? I'd have laid, what he said, only 179 houses destroyed, probably at least 9 of them quite decent ones. And indeed, the coverage of the Rising again highlighted this suggestion that the misery of the slums, the foulest spot in Europe, that this was in some way linked to the civil unrest. And this is, again, one of the arguments that plays out throughout the 20s in terms of providing homes for citizens of the new state. Oliver St. John Gogarty, during Baby Week 1917, wrote a very provocative piece, as he was wont to do, about our Herodian city fathers and their baby-killing tenements. Because, of course, one of the things that the inquiry had thrown up was the fact that corporation members, in some cases, were also slumlords. And furthermore, that some corporation members had a vested interest in not allowing suburbanisation because they were small traders and their business would be eroded and destroyed. So we get this kind of a cartoon here, the slum owner who is a member of the corporation weeping crocodile tears over the lot of the poor while they are robbing them. Which was perhaps harsh, but not entirely fair, but an important perspective when we see there's a lot of political infighting about what's going to happen next. So what did the City Fathers do to solve the tenements? This is new housing built by the corporation at Inchicore in 1911, by the way. The earliest schemes, we've already seen that they got off to a slow start. They had built 12 schemes before 1914, about twice as many flats as cottages. One of the worst things that they did was that almost half of the flats had only one room. We're trying to get rid of one-room tenements and we're building one-room flats. Not such a good idea. And of course, the accusations proved to be correct. We're creating slums for the future. One of the earliest schemes at Bow Lane West, Fred Allen gave me this picture, it no longer exists. These are actually flats, even though they kind of look like houses. The corporation itself admitted in 1924 that these were badly designed, constructed with bad materials, and had bad drainage. Couldn't really get much worse than that. Not so successful. They were trying to build cheaply so that they would be affordable. But of course, that sort of backfired. More successful were these kind of cottage, they always called them cottages. Houses were always referred to as cottages by the corporation. Maybe they still do today, I don't know, Kieran can tell us. But these 2 up, 2 down style red brick houses that you see dotted around the city were quite popular with tenants. They're quite high density, but they worked. Less successful, this kind of flat development. But when they came to redevelop Church Street, this is the site of the tenement collapse, they built this sort of quite high density development, cottage development. It's by 1918 then, despite all of the limitations placed on construction by the war effort, the materials shortages, the fraught political situation at home, the difficulty of obtaining loans to build, the corporation was still thinking about it and trying to do things, and ideas were evolving. So we see Cantfort in 1918, the naming obviously significant in itself, having additional features and looking quite different already, with higher standards of accommodation. They're providing a parlour room, so it's not just the bare necessities. There's an indoor toilet. There are gardens where people can grow vegetables. So we're seeing an evolution. The survey of the North City that was undertaken in 1918, another reminder of the extent of the problem. So it's kind of a strange map, because you have to realise that the bottom of it is the River Liffey. So we're only seeing the north side, the circular roads here, and then moving out towards Fairview. And this found, surprise, surprise, things were getting worse. The colours on the map, the yellow is where we have tenement houses, and the red is where there are ruins and wasteland. So again, extensive areas throughout the North City. They showed that average weekly rents were somewhere about 2 to 3 shillings for one of these single-room tenements, and somewhere between 2 and 6 and 4 and 6 for 2-room letting. Now, a lot of families in this survey were found to be eking out an existence on less than 10 shillings a week. They were surviving with a little bit of assistance from the Poor Law Union and various charities. So the difficulty of providing those people with accommodation at rents that they'd be able to pay was absolutely huge. I've already spoken about that. Now, this map is also from that survey, and this is the schemes in contemplation, I love that term, by the Housing Committee, and they're coloured in red. So we've got some in the inner city, and we have these two here, Marino and Drumcondra, which do eventually come to be built in the 1920s, though not as depicted. What we can't see from this map is what the Housing Committee was thinking, which was that the first line of attack should be tenement refurbishment. The second line of attack in the housing war was going to be building central housing at 25 houses to the acre. And the third and least desirable line of attack was to be the suburban building. That was a poor third. The virgin sites would only be used because they had to rehouse the remainder. They didn't have enough central sites. Also in 1918, we see a very early proposal for Marino. This is not what was ultimately proceeded with. And this is another sketch from the same time of what the houses at Marino were going to look like. Marino is hugely significant because it shows the key departures which were to shape Dublin's future. That sounds rather dramatic, but if we look, this is Marino as built. What happens at Marino is the idea that we're going to provide single-family homes at low densities in what were known as garden suburbs, and that really influenced what was to follow. The idea was adapted from the UK, following on this garden city idea from Ebenezer Howard at the turn of the 20th century, this idea of the perfect marriage of town and country. And it seemed to offer almost a wonderful alternative to the awfulness of the slums. It was the garden city and garden suburb, as it Hampstead, sort of got its visual realisation in the work of Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker. And they had a very particular physical form. It was low density, it was safe, it was non-threatening design, a sort of villagey feel. And it was very inspirational compared to the slum-ridden cities, and was taken up enthusiastically by the early modern town planning movement, by a lot of people who wanted to address Dublin's problems, not so enthusiastically by the Housing Committee of Dublin Corporation, who said it was too idealistic for the job in hand. In one report, we accept the paper ideal of garden suburbs, but we must from our experience give expression to the opinion that it is impossible for a man earning from 25 to 30 shillings per week to pay 6 and 6pence per week rent and pay tram fares to and from his work. And particularly Tom Kelly was vehemently opposed to the notion of garden suburb, and in fact had the words garden suburb removed from all documentation relating to Marino. However, Marino, beginning in 1923, is the start of something new. These cottage estates, which are to be on a larger scale than previous schemes, so was ultimately 1,400 houses or thereabouts in Marino. It introduces the principle of tenant purchase, that people will eventually be able to own their own homes. Now remember, around about the start of the First World War, across society, only about 10% of all people in all classes were homeowners. 90% of people were renters. So the idea that working class people would be afforded the opportunity to own their own homes was quite radical. Marino is at a low density of 12 to the acre, 12 houses to the acre, quite large houses, 3-bedroomed houses, parlour type houses they were called. And importantly, the design was intended to be a model one in many ways. This was intended to influence not just the corporation's attempts, but all other housing across the city. They felt that other developers would follow and be influenced by what happened in Marino. So there's a lot of interesting things in terms of layout and grouping of houses, the variety of materials used, the methods used, and so on, cul-de-sacs, open spaces. These are all very, very different to what we have seen, for example, in that bird's eye view I showed you. The other thing was that private development took place at the edges of the scheme. The sites were provided by the corporation to others to develop so that they would be at a standard that the corporation wished for. So this is a kind of variety of housing. Looks a bit pixelated, but hopefully you can't see it anyway from the back, so it doesn't matter too much. Or from the air as it looked in the 1950s. There was lots of open space. There was opportunity for people to have gardens, allotments, playing areas, safe playgrounds for children, and so on. The areas of bowling greens and so on were marked in the original plans. And a very attractive environment was created. Now I'm just going to zip through this text. But just to say that at Marino we have shops which are designed by the city architect, and the individual plots were leased to people who would have them built themselves. At the main frontages, which are here at the Malahide Road, and here on the new 100-foot road, which becomes Griffith Avenue, we have other operators, including these public utility societies, which are a form of early housing co-op, and the Guild of Building Workers building other houses as well. So what we end up having is more of a social mix going on in Marino than would otherwise have been the case. And we have different variations in the housing style as well. This is just one of those shops that I mentioned. I love this picture because it's pre-health and safety. We can see all of the sides of meat hanging out. And these are some of those houses that I mentioned, the co-op style housing. Now Marino was perceived to be a great success, but again there's this ongoing debate about where the tenement dwellers should be rehoused, intertwined with arguments about the preference for cottages over flats, even though we have already seen there were houses at high density in the centre. The Mothers' Union, however, was very clear. The president of the Mothers' Union here talking about people being condemned to dwell in flats, in decaying and depressing surroundings. The happy pride which young folk take in a pleasant cottage home is denied to thousands of our citizens. Instead of healthy gardens or fields, the streets full of squalid sites are the playground of young Dublin. And this is a very familiar theme right through the sort of family values and how could you possibly grow up anyway normal if you lived in overcrowded tenement conditions. There was only one flat scheme built in the 20s at Boyne Street, which is sort of at the back of Pearse Station here, which was actually, I think, probably the first duplex type accommodation in Dublin. At ground level there was a single-storey dwelling, and then around the back which is where we are here, you go up the stairs and into a 2-storey unit. But of course, it was absolutely roundly condemned. These were inhuman packing cases. It was a return to the bad old flat system. And in the civic survey, we've already seen the maps, they talk about the inevitable surroundings of the dwelling. This focus on the environment, the public house and the street corner, the paved thoroughfare as a playground for the children. And that was then being contrasted with the likes of Marino. This is the back of those houses I showed you earlier at Croydon Park in Marino, where the father has a little plot for gardening, the mother has space for drying clothes, because of course she's working all the time, and the children in the garden immune from traffic dangers. The first environment is a slum, the second a home. Okay, so you can see these arguments coming through. After Marino, we see things very quickly starting to change. Drumcondra had houses that were smaller than those at Marino, and tenant purchase started to prove to be a problem. People couldn't afford the houses, basically. So halfway through the development of Cabra, they moved back to building houses for rental. And they also started to build on a larger scale with less of the variety, which led to quite a lot of criticism, as in the case of Crumlin. Now, a brief aside here is the fact that there were other people involved in the housing drive. This is Housing Week in 1925, the Central Housing Council, and a list of the great and the good who were involved in various capacities in trying to do something about housing in Dublin, including my own personal hero, Reverend Hall, who was the founder of the Public Utility Society movement, the cooperative societies, I suppose, if you like, for housing. He talks about tenant purchase as being important because people don't appreciate things that are given to them for nothing. He said, that which a man gains by the strength of his own right hand is more prized by him than all the philanthropic sops that a generous public has in its gift. Which I think is somewhat wise. These are some of the houses built not by the corporation in Drumcondra, but by these utility societies. So the corporation wasn't just developing houses itself, it was also providing sites for others to build houses, was providing rates remissions and other facilities to enable housing to be built. However, of course, things don't immediately pan out very simply. I've already suggested that all was not well despite the idealism of the garden suburbs in the 20s. There's an Irish press campaign in the mid-30s about the slums in Dublin. This is 8 people living in a one-room tenement depicted in this particular image. What we see is that the state and the corporation stayed through new legislation on slum clearance in the early 30s, and the corporation too realised that they have to row back a bit on the idealism. So what we see is that the garden suburb is idealistic, but Tom Kelly was right, it's not going to solve all the problems. There's still nearly 19,000 families living in one-room tenements in 1927. And what they decide to do is to build more flats in the centre for the people who can't afford to move out to the suburbs. Ironically, as it happens, it costs them 3 times as much to build the flats as it did to build the houses, and they were let at a cheaper rent, but that's by the way. This is Crumlin under construction. One of the key features, I love the workers have all left their bicycles outside the buildings. And everything is being done, as you see, manually. This is in the era before we have ready-mix concrete, for example. And we'll see that's important when we build the flats too. No hard hats there. What we see in Crumlin is less a variety in the architecture. In fact, there were anecdotes that when the schemes were starting to be occupied, people arriving home, and before they had all the street signs up and all that kind of thing organised, people kept getting lost and not being able to find their own front doors because they all looked the same. So these sort of things were ultimately criticised. By 1945, the city engineer was arguing that we should never go back to these single-class housing areas in large scale as had been built at Crumlin and Cabra. Okay, so that was an issue. Within the central areas, what we see is the very higgledy-piggledy courts and lanes and back alleys being redeveloped. If you can see this map, we're looking, again, this is Church Street here, a bit further south from the earlier scheme, and this is Greek Street, so we're right at the back. The forecourts is just off our map. And we're going to be looking towards the church here in the next slide, because what I find remarkable about this image, it's from the Dublin Corporation's own collections, is it's showing us these very modern, streamlined flats, almost like a spaceship in the middle of this backdrop of the filthy ancient ruins that seem to have emerged out of. And there's some praise too at the time for the ingenuity being displayed in these new dwellings and the various facilities. The scullery has a bath and a tabletop, so you can put a tabletop on top of your bath and use it. You have electric light, you have a lavatory, you have dust chutes in the upper four flats. All this for 6 shillings per week. But we still have stringent, all the time arguments against flats. It's not a proper home for human beings. If communist organiser wished to lay plans for the development of communist cells throughout Dublin, could he do better than dot the city with these large barracks of propertyless men? And this is a common thing. The Irish Times is saying the same thing about the communists in the 1950s. I don't have time for the quote today. And the city is being dramatically changed. The old gasometer here in the background is sort of your perspective here. This is February 1935, Hanover Street, which is now Pierce House scheme. This is the start, and as you see, everything is being done manually. There's no ready mix or any of the sophisticated construction tools. This is March. This is April. The gasometer is gradually disappearing. This is June and August, when it's almost at completion. I'll include my favourite scheme, Chancery Place, right beside the forecourts, heavily criticised for its location as being inappropriate, and this larger scheme at the back of Aldborough House. So there's great work being done. But because they were constantly trying to save money, they had to pare back on what they really wanted to do. And this led to issues, particularly in this case, the rooms were obviously smaller than they should be. With a rising demand for comfort and floor space occasioned by increasing standards of living, these buildings will be out of date before they are worn out. Very interesting perspective there. And again, Irish Times telling us, we shouldn't be building flats. Even from the standpoint of civic beauty, they should be banished. By the emergency, we see a 10-year building programme planned, and then it all has to be put on hold, and we're just ticking over during the emergency. We start to recondition tenements. We actually have to build more cottage schemes because we don't have the steel and copper and lead for the flats and so on. And the tenements are still there. This is a shot from the 1940s near Parnell Street. Won't talk about that. By the start of the 1950s then, we still have 28,500 families in tenements. We still have a debate about where to build. We still have a problem because the corporation, in trying to provide housing, is left with a situation where they're not able to provide all the amenities to go in these new areas because they're putting in housing first, and they're always being criticised for that. However, we do see private developers starting to adopt the same standards as the corporation and building at lower densities, more imaginative design and so on. And we're moving towards low density suburbs with home ownership becoming more and more the norm. Excuse me. The 1946 census showed us that we had a long way to go. Only 60% of houses had an indoor toilet. A third of those indoor toilets were being shared with other families. Only 48% of homes had a fixed bath. In fact, the new corporation schemes came out quite well out of this because those areas tend to fare better than a lot of the private areas. Corporation decides to experiment more with tenure mix in the 50s, again trying to mix up the different social, get it more of a social mix. They start to build tenant purchase houses again at Annandale here, which is in Fairview, and at St. Anne's. And what we see happening then in the 50s is the north side being opened up further away, from Finglas through Santry, Artane, Coolock, Colester, Raheny, Kilbarrack, all because of sewers. Up until then, we had a problem. We couldn't build houses in those areas. So we were going to see a very dramatic change. This is people taking advantage of the dry weather on the farm at Kappa House in Coolock in September 1950. That is going to dramatically change. And one aspect of this period is the way in which the social geography of the city evolves. Because the city estate had more land available to it on the north side, north of the Liffey, but it's interspersed with pockets of private housing. You have a much more of a patchwork on the north side than to the south. And the earlier development of the south of these suburbs in the township era had paved the way for a greater concentration of private middle class housing to the south. So the south is perhaps less mixed. This is a map showing the new city boundary, which has been extended. This is Coolock. This is the Artane roundabout, and there's a vast swathe of land here. This is 59, when we're going to start seeing a lot of development in this area. And the aerial view of from 57 of this is the roundabout again, looking out into the open countryside. The brand new Cadbury's factory has just moved out from East Wall. It's here, but I picked this because it shows us we have a spread of low density, low rise, single family houses. And ultimately that is one of the things that we see happening as a result really of this adoption of the garden suburb model. And it's not just private housing, it's a mixture here. On this side we have the corporation housing. On this side we have my house is there. Hang on, have I got it wrong? This is the corporation area. This housing, which is supposedly private housing, is actually built with various government grants. The people who occupy these houses are largely availing of the Small Dwellings Acquisition Act, equivalent to what has just been announced on Monday, I think, where we have cheap mortgages being provided through the corporation. So right across the city we're seeing similar takeover of the countryside, but we're also seeing that the corporation is very heavily involved, not just in what we see as being corporation housing. Now, I'm sorry, I see the time and I can't talk about all of these wonderful things, but just to bring us to 1966, where in that year the corporation was spending $7.75 million on Dublin housing. But the remarkable statistic hidden in the middle of this article is that in 1966, 50% of Dubliners were living in housing that was Dublin Corporation housing. 50% of the population. I want to remind you, in 1879, 47% of Dublin's population was living in tenements. I think that's some achievement. And if we look at the lives that were changed, we see Ballyfermot, we see Finglas, and yet all the time poor old corporation is being lambasted. Here the Institute of Architects giving out about the fact that in this case it was the playground in Coolock that had been delayed, and they're saying we shouldn't do this. These amenities should all be in place before the first families arrive. Yeah, we know that, but we're doing our best here. Please give us a break. It didn't seem to bother the kids who were actually playing in Coolock. They sort of found a way around the problem. This is some of the early housing. So just to draw it to close, even in the 1930s, we see a lot of self-criticism. The Citizens Housing Council observed it's highly probable that future generations will stigmatise and not praise the results of our best endeavours to house the workers. The corporation itself said the standard of accommodation has been unfavourably criticised. It should be pointed out that the policy of affording the greatest good for the greatest number with the financial resources available has influenced the corporation. And if we look, I forgot to press the right button, the magic button, I haven't broken it. 50 years separate this image from 1913 of slum dwellers and the clean new housing here in Coolock. Less than 20 years separate this image of the many families living in this tenement house on Chancery Lane and the handing over of the keys of her new home to Mrs. Walsh in Pembroke. They're not all members of her family, I should say. And that's actually Tom Crampton there, who was involved in building the house. So it's a remarkable, her very own house, and yet there was such harsh criticism. It shouldn't detract from the very real achievements of the times. Tenements are a memory today. These fine apartments with their sun balconies designed by Herbert Sims have stood the test of time, I think. And we see changing life opportunities for people. There is an inevitable nostalgia, in fact, for the past and the sense of community in the tenements. Many people I've spoken to over the years have told me quite proudly that their families came from the tenements. But they were also quite happy to tell me that how thrilled they were and how they remember getting their house and moving into these new areas. Yes, there were teething problems, but despite all of that, over time, new communities were established and the suburbs became home. So despite the various ups and downs of the housing programme, I think that we can say Dublin Corporation succeeded in giving decent quality homes and a sense of respect to a previously impoverished population. And they gave them something else. They gave them hope for a brighter future. So I hope that our present leaders can be inspired to do likewise. And I'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you.